Today we're going to be making the cement lamp, which you can make at home easily with some cement, some wood, some other bits here and there, and which we can turn on with the touch sensor with 3 different settings. Let's get started. So let's draw this out. If we're going to make this out of cement, we're going to need to make a mold. So for today's design, we'll keep it simple and make it into a square or a rectangle. Then we'll screw in a light bulb here on top. And then we'll put a touch sensor strip to turn on the light bulb. Then we'll have a power source, as we want this to be practical and not have to replace batteries every now and then. Oh, and one more thing, we can't forget a lampshade. To make this mold, we'll look to cut 4 3/4 inch thick pieces of wood laid out in this fashion. The dimensions of the lamp will be 3 1/4 inch by 3 1/4 inch. Since the thickness of the wood is about 3/4 inch thick, we're going to need 2 pieces of 3 3/4 inch pieces of wood and 2 4 3/4 inch pieces of wood. And then we'll cut them out of this scrap piece of wood that I have laying around to get our desired lengths. The other parts I will need to cut is optional, but I think it will add something extra to the look of our lamps. I have this scrap 1.5 by 1.5 piece of oak, which I think will be a nice piece of wood to add to the corners to embed into our cement block. And it'll go something along these areas. Next, I'll lay out some of the materials needed and some of the tools. Now, a lot of these items can be found at your local hardware store, but I'll put some links in the description below. We'll need a heavy-duty felt for the base, a copper strip with adhesive backing, a touch sensor, a light bulb socket, power cord, and a lampshade. Now, some of the tools needed are a tape measure, your handy drill, some wooden screws, a hot glue gun with plenty of sticks, a mold release wax, and some baby powder could work instead, but this is best result. Now you're gonna need a soldering iron and some styrofoam. And before I forget, we'll need to cut out a board to act as a temporary base. Next, I'll use my Dremel tool, and it's your preference as to what method you use to carve these pieces of oak, but you can sand it or use a knife to carve it out, or you may decide not to use it and not to embed wood into your design. It's really your preference. All right, let's get carving. And here are the results. This is the raised portion that's going to be floating around. Here's the corner piece that's going to be on the bottom. Now you can see I made some pockets and some channels. And this is so that the cement can flow well into them and get to the edges of our design. And the features will pop and show, but also adhere to the cement. And that way you can avoid getting any air pockets. All right, so let's lay out our mold. Now, if you have some bent scrap pieces that you decide to cut, I try to put these so that part that bows out is on the outside, and I'll show you a fix throughout this process. So I'm going to use some wooden screws to hold these together, 1/4 inch flatheads Phillips, but you can use anything else you want. You just want to retain it. I don't expect the cement to exert too much pressure inside, as most of the volume is going to be filled with our sensors and wiring. Now, the reason we're using the width of the boards on these pieces and why they're so tall compared to the lamp itself is because they come straight on the edges. So we can take advantage of these straight edges to level out the mold as we assemble it, making sure we don't get a leaning tower-like structure. Okay, so we're almost done here. You'll notice that the pieces are bowing a little, as I mentioned before. So this could happen, and we're going to have to screw in the edges flat, then press in the center where it's bowing as we drill into our mold to hold the 2 pieces together. And here you can see how the gap is now smaller and even across the board. And don't worry too much about the gaps, as we're going to be sealing them in the process before we pour our cement in. Now I'm labeling which way is up, so I know the bottom is the flattest surface to keep this level. Now that we have our mold done, I draw a line on the high where I expect the height of the cement to go to, and I'm going to lay out some of the parts just to get an idea of where things are going to go. And we're going to need to cut a piece of styrofoam to create a negative void and make some room for the sensors and space for the wiring. Now, fair warning, this part can get messy. As you can see here, I got styrofoam all over the place. Just don't tell my wife. Next, we'll need to choose where and how we want our wires to go through in the styrofoam. And I'm using a pick of similar diameter as the wires, so that way I can poke a path through so we can push the wires through and then seal them afterwards. And now I'm twisting the wires so that way it can be more stiff or less malleable as I'm pushing the wire through. In a sense, it's almost like you're trying to push a rope, which you can't, obviously. So I'm trying to make this as stiff as I can as I'm pushing it through the path that I just made. That'll give me good control without kinking the wire. And here we are. All right, next we're going to need to make a hole in our mold so we can pass the sensor wire through. And I'm choosing to put it towards the center of my cement area so as to prevent any cracking along the edges. Now, before installing this sensor wire, I'll be coating it with a generous amount of mold release. And same process as before, with our light bulb wires, I'm going to make a path for this sensor wire into the styrofoam. Next, we'll need to install our anchors. And to do this, we're going to be using some wooden screws on our oak pieces, slightly longer than the ones I'm using in the mold itself. And now the heads of the wooden screws are going to act as anchors in the cement. So even if you tip this over, the wood itself should not move away from the cement. Now I'm also being careful not to have the heads pointing too far in so that it won't interfere with the styrofoam area. And I don't want them to be too far out that it'll potentially cause problems on the outer cement walls, causing any crackings or anything like that. And these will look something like this. We're almost there, guys. Next, we're gonna prep our mold. To do this, I'm gonna remove the assembly we just put in. That was just for mock-up. And I want to make sure that the mold on the inside surfaces is nice and clean. You also want to make sure that your hands are clean. Next, we're going to apply some mold release, and you're going to want to be very generous on the edges so as to seal the edges from the cement. And you run your finger with slight pressure so that will give it a nice fillet, low radius on the corners. You want to make sure you're applying it evenly as well. Now I put a hole in the center of the baseboard and create a bit of a chamfer on both sides to protect the wires. Now we have to glue our parts down to the base, making sure they're firmly held down. And you may want to seal the hole with some hot glue so as to prevent any leakage, and also around the edges of the styrofoam. And as I'm doing this, I just want to remind you, also try to seal with some hot glue on the top of the wires. Basically think, where could water leak from? Otherwise, when you leave this sitting overnight to dry, you're going to run into some surprises when you come back. Then we installed our mold with the wire through, as well as the oak pieces to the correct height. And here's a quick look from the top. I used a paper clip to hold the floating oak piece up against the styrofoam since I can't reach with the glue gun down in this depth with a short amount of space. And lastly, we'll screw the base of the mold and then use your hot glue gun to seal up the edges from the outside. And before you apply any cement, I'm going to say this right now, you want to inspect your entire mold to make sure it's nice and leak free. Now I'm going to be using a tape roll to be able to hold this whole assembly upright and leveled while protecting the wires coming out of here. And to hold the socket aligned, I'm using a couple of socket extensions and an adapter I had laying around. One of them doesn't even work, so I won't mind if this gets some cement on them. Now I won't bore you with the cement pouring and mixing, so just follow the instructions on the packaging and you'll be golden. And here's another look from the top before we apply cement. Now here's a pro tip. So instead of buying an expensive container that you can mix some cement in, and we're not going to be using that much cement in here to begin with, I'm taking a gallon jug and I'm cutting it in half. Now 1/2 will be good for mixing, while the other half will be good for pouring. And you can even create a nozzle for smaller areas by squeezing the end. And I guess you can say that this way you are recycling. I hope this helps someone out, as it did for me. So we pour the cement and we let this sit overnight. And now it should be nice and dry, at least from the top. Now maybe this will help someone when doing this, so here's the trick. I used a couple of paper clips with some hot glue to hold the sockets in place, centered and upright. That way you don't have to hold it all night. And now to take the mold apart, just undo every screw first. And then using a flathead screwdriver, carefully pry each board apart without damaging the cement. And when you pull the board, just be careful with the sensor wire as well. Don't forget that it's attached. And now here's the result. You'll notice there are some white edges or some discoloration on the surfaces, and this is just the residue from the mold release. And we're gonna remove this later, so don't be too concerned about it. Now, after you remove the panels, you'll also notice the discoloration across the height of the cement, and that is due to the cement not being fully and evenly dry. So before we begin removing the base and finishing this off, we'll need to give it a couple more days just to fully dry, as we don't want to risk anything at this point. We put too much work and effort into this. We're almost there, guys. And now that we have the base removed and all the boards and it's fully dry, we can carve out the styrofoam from the bottom and empty out the cavity so we can access this area and install our sensor and conclude our wiring. And here's the result. Now I use some picks, one of them with a 90-degree bend, and some tweezers so I can get most of the styrofoam out as much as I could. And for this step, you'll need a power cord and your sensor. Now the sensor comes with a nice wiring diagram, and you can follow that with one that comes along with the power cord as well. If you follow the instructions and read carefully, apply your safety, you'll be golden. Now if you have any questions throughout the entire process, please feel free to post them in the comment section below, and I will try to help you through it. Now excuse the mess, but I wanted to show you this before I kept going. You can see how I installed the sensor in the cavity, and I did all the wiring tucked into the pocket. Now you'll also notice how I'm holding onto the power cord with some hot glue, and next we're going to put the felt down. Now I installed the felt on the bottom, cut it to size, and filled any irregularities on the bottom of the cement from our mold process with some hot glue as well, so that it's all even and leveled. With some 80 to 400 grit sandpaper, we can remove any loose bits and clean up all our wooden sections. For the sensor wire, we'll want to cut the wire short and then strip the jacket off as far back as we can using the X-Acto knife if possible. We'll need to get as close as possible into this hole so we can get the most wiring out of this. Then we'll need to spread out the wires side to side, just like so. And I'll use a pick to slowly carve out a small channel on each side, just so I can recess some copper tape and then place the wire bent into that pocket we just made. Don't worry, I'll show you how this comes out. And the point is that we want the copper tape and the sensor wire flush to the surface. So that way when we come back with the second layer of copper tape, you won't notice any difference. So once you have the surfaces cleaned off and everything sanded to your liking, this will be a good time to apply some stone sealer. And this is used to seal the surfaces and protect them over time. Now this is optional, but I highly recommend it. And here is how the wire soldered to the tape looks like in the channel we created with the pick. Now we'll wrap the tape evenly across and all around the lamp, then repeat the process up to the wire. Once we get to the other side, tuck in the tape into the cavity, and then pull down the wires down and pour some solder into it. And here's the result. You'll want the wire and the tape to end up looking as flush to the surface like this. Now the purpose of the solder is to ensure the wires won't come springing out once you try to bend them into the cavity, and also they don't move out of place as you move this around. And now this is how it looks after a second layer of copper tape. Now we can install the light bulb and our lampshade. Now we can plug it in, and all we have to do is touch this copper tape to turn the light on. And you'll have 3 different settings with this sensor. You'll have a high, a mid, and a low. Now you'll notice these two lamps look differently, and this is due to how much water you put into your cement mix and how you pour your cement into the mold. You can play around with the mixtures and then you can get a smoother result or more rustic look like we did today. It is really to your preference, but you can see how creative you can get with these. Now we hope you liked this project today. If you did, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and we'll see you next one. Bye!